Good evening, everyone. My name is Tiffany Card. I'm with the ALS Association Greater New York chapter. Thank you for all attending this evening, an ALS journey, an interview and discussion. Tonight with activist and author Jeremey Schreiber. You can tell it's him because he has The Invisible Nation, the book, up in his corner there in his video. We also have host Elliott Forrest from WQXR. And we have Kristen Kokeman, who is the President and CEO. So before we get started, let me do just a little bit of housekeeping of how we're going to run the evening. And so I just want to let you know that we're here with Elliott, James, and Jeremey. And tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. So in case you missed something or want to share it with friends, you'll be able to do that. I would imagine it should be up in the next couple of days, we hope. I want to let you know, Jeremey, who's here with us, has lost his ability to speak, certainly not his voice. So tonight, WQXR host Elliott Forrest will guide us through Jeremey's journey with ALS, and you will see pre-recorded sessions of James Naughton reading selections from Jeremey's book, The Invisible Nation. With the help of modern technology, we submitted questions to Jeremey before tonight's event, and Jeremey was able to pre-record his answers, which you will hear throughout the evening. We will not be taking questions live tonight. However, if you do have any questions for any of our panelists, you can email them at events@als-ny.org, and we will gather your questions and forward them. I will also drop that email into the chat so you all can see it. Now, a few words from our President and CEO, Kristen Kokeman.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I would just like to start by saying a very big thank you to everyone involved in putting this evening together and what I hope will be a very informative discussion, and hopefully also the first of many of these new series, sharing an ALS journey. As everyone in our ALS community knows, the ALS journey is a very unique and personal one for all that are involved. And we are very grateful that Jeremey Schreiber has agreed to share his journey with us this evening. I also want to thank Elliott Forrest for helping us make this happen tonight. And to the very talented two-time Tony Award winning actor James Naughton for agreeing to be our narrator for this evening and reading excerpts from Jeremey's memoir. So thank you to everyone. We hope that this will raise awareness. We hope that you will share the messages that you hear this evening from all of us. The more we share, the more awareness we create. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Kristen. And that is a reminder, May is ALS Awareness Month, which is one of the reasons we really are so excited about sort of hopefully this can become a series and that we kick off with Jeremey. So let me introduce tonight's guests and give you a little background on where they come from and sort of what they do when they're not here. So our host, Elliott Forrest's voice, you may be familiar with to many here tonight, as he can be heard on 105.9 FM WQXR and WNYC in New York. Elliott is also the producer and production designer for the national tour and evening with Itzhak Perlman. And I think you have a couple of performances booked starting in January of next year, right?
Yeah, we do. We're going back on the road. Life hopefully will return to normal.
Great, that's so exciting. I think we're all excited for a little bit of more normalcy, whatever that is. Excuse me. He also directed the Fusion Oratorio, Considering Matthew Shepard, Craig Hella Johnson and Conspiriere for KLRU PBS TV in Austin. Special aired in 2018. He also produces projections, lighting, and theatrical elements for major orchestras around the country, including the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Houston Symphony, the New York Philharmonic, the Atlantic Symphony, the Pasadena Pops, and the Little Orchestra Society in New York. And let's not forget, he is also the executive director of Arts Rock, a nonprofit organization on all kinds of concerts and interviews located in Rockland County. Welcome, Elliott.
Thank you for having me.
Tonight's special guest, of course, includes Jeremey Schreiber, who's an entrepreneur, a writer, and an ALS warrior. He first started to write and speak openly about his own experiences after being diagnosed with ALS in January 2018. From his personal story, he offers his unique perspective into a world where injustice is frequently, unapologetically out in the open. Through his work, Jeremey aims to help and motivate people with disabilities to improve their lives and to overcome the challenges they face. He also gives a voice to people whose society has turned invisible, covering such topics as travel, new treatments, medical marijuana, and technology. Greetings, Jeremey. And tonight's selections will be read by James Naughton, winner of 2 Tony Awards as Best Actor in a Musical for his portrayal of a media-savvy lawyer, Billy Flynn, in the Broadway hit Chicago in 1997, and for his role as film noir era detective in City of Angels in 1990, which also earned him the Drama Desk Award. You also may recognize him from his many film and TV credits, including The Devil Wears Prada, First Wives Club, Planet of the Apes, Who's the Boss, Ally McBeal, Damages, Gossip Girl, and most recently, Blue Bloods, The Blacklist, and The Affair. All right, Elliott, it's you and Jeremey now. Take it away.
Tiffany, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this tonight. This is going to be fun and informative, I hope both. It's a real honor to speak with Jeremey, who is a true warrior. Good evening to all. We're going to hear, as you just heard from 2-time winner James Naughton, a little bit later on. He's going to be reading some selections from Jeremey's book. But first off, a few bits of information, as you probably may know. I hope I get it right. ALS is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a progressive neurodegenerative disease that affects the nerve cells in the brain and the spinal cord. Patients in the latter stages of the disease may become totally paralyzed. I became personally a little bit more aware of ALS recently with the loss of Rebecca Luker, one of Broadway's brightest stars. I'm friends with her husband, Danny Burstein, and was a part of a couple of events. And the only bright light of the whole of losing Rebecca is that we have so many recordings and videos of her beautiful spirit that are still with us. Tiffany will speak at the end of the evening about the Greater New York chapter and how you can help. But first, I want to welcome Jeremey. It seems that your process of being diagnosed is similar to many others. I heard this with Danny and Becca Luker, that it takes months, sometimes 9 months, to figure out exactly what it is, that there's no specific test. I've heard that. And it becomes really a process of elimination. You write that it was not long after the Brooklyn half marathon in May of 2016 that you experienced shin splints in both legs and went through some physical therapy, but it wasn't really getting any better. So tell us what was going on in your head, Jeremey, and when you were finally diagnosed.
When you're living and working day in and out with ALS, as many of us attending this event are, it's easy to forget how rare this disease actually is. Only 1 person in 50,000 are diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease each year. That number is across the globe. The 9 months of inconclusive doctor's appointments leading up to the diagnosis, and after reading all of WebMD, I braced myself for the possibility that what I was going to hear on January 5, 2018, would change our lives forever. I was terrified, we all were. I never thought we'd be praying for cancer, or one of the multitude of other diseases with the 3-letter acronyms. Looking back, I remember talking about the what-ifs. What if I needed round-the-clock care? What if my apartment couldn't accommodate everything I needed? What if my insurance runs out? No one could prepare us for what ALS had in store for us.
We're going to hear now from actor James Naughton. He's going to read from chapter 1 of Jeremey's book after Jeremey received his diagnosis.
I didn't have time to make my way through whatever stages of grief my therapist told me I was supposed to experience. I needed to throw this life into overdrive and hurry up. But hurry up doing what? Whatever it was going to be had to happen, and fast. Questions flooded in from everyone and everywhere. My own brain was proving to be the greatest and, quite frankly, the least helpful source. I had a choice: climb into bed and pull the covers over my head, or say fuck it and fight this thing head on. After a few days of deep depression, I took a hard look at the reality of the situation. I stood in my apartment on crutches, staring into the floor-length mirror in my hallway, and told myself I was going to fight this thing with everything I had. There were mountains of information, yet it all said pretty much the same thing. I had no idea where ALS had come from, as there was no family history of it. With ALS, there's no real way to manage the symptoms, and statistically, you have only 2 to 5 years to live and to get your affairs in order. Surely not every person with ALS sat around waiting to die. I needed to find out who the pioneers were and what they were doing to beat the statistics, and then build on that. All this while holding down a marriage, a job, and managing my own sanity. As the symptoms progressed, my world began to shrink. Traveling around the city became increasingly more difficult, as broken curbs, heavy doors, and inaccessible buildings created new obstacles for me to manage and to break my spirit. The unfriendliness of how the world is built would now add an unwelcome layer of complexity to this uphill battle that I was facing. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, would surely come to the rescue, ensuring I could easily get in and around the places I needed, just like everyone else. Fat chance. It soon became clear to me that ADA compliance is a box-checking exercise for builders and landlords alike. Much to everyone's surprise, ADA compliance doesn't actually mean handicapped usable. The list of places I could go unassisted was shrinking by the day. Doors were now more difficult to open. Cabs were more challenging to get in and out of, and wide open spaces lacking something to grab onto were terrifying to traverse. My days were planned around the fewest possible steps, as nothing was handicapped accessible the way I needed it. Come to think of it, how many people do you see around your town with wheelchairs or walkers? Far fewer than you first imagined, I'm sure. I was being kicked to the curb by society and becoming invisible to the world. I was silently being told, fuck you, your kind doesn't belong here. My intention in writing this book isn't to elicit sympathy. Rather, I want to shine a spotlight on how our society treats those of us who have disabilities by categorically ignoring, overlooking, and otherwise making us invisible. ALS was simply my VIP backstage pass into this experience.
Jeremy, it sounds like you were not only dealing with the diagnosis, but as your symptoms progressed, you were also dealing with the very real issue of how our world is built for those who may be differently abled, and it doesn't really work for everybody. It's really built for not that much of convenience. You mentioned several different instances that you became aware of this. We're going to hear James read about the time you went to Irving, Texas for business. Can you share with us what you've learned about navigating a world not built for you or others in similar situations?
First things first. If you ever forget you have a disability, inevitably someone or something will remind you. Whether it's an uneven sidewalk that sends you to the ground, or an Uber vehicle that's impossible to get into, or even a website with the wrong combination of colors, it becomes painfully obvious that this world wasn't built for people with disabilities. I was living in New York City for a decade before I needed around-the-clock care. Once the first symptom made me feel truly different, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I started paying close attention to the people on the sidewalk and in the subway. I couldn't find any people walking around with even a hint of a disability. No walkers, no prosthetics, and certainly no wheelchairs. It was a sobering realization. The biggest takeaway was that you have to ditch your pride, and ask for what you want or need. People are more willing to help than you realize. I just finished a year-long process working with the FCC, to get WhatsApp to make their web app more accessible. You probably won't notice the subtle change, but it will enable people with disabilities to use the app independently. The moral of the story is, advocacy must be a central theme in your life. Advocate for yourself, advocate for your loved one, and advocate for what you feel is right. But by all means, don't sit on the sidelines expecting anyone to do anything for you.
Jeremy, I couldn't agree with you more. I experienced this personally, as Tiffany was saying. I produced Itzhak Perlman's latest concert tour. Many people listening to him on the radio, world-class violinist for 60 some odd years, but contracted polio when he was 5, and he's been in a wheelchair and crutches and now a scooter for his entire life. And just getting around the stage, going to dinner, we became aware how difficult it was. Airplanes, almost impossible. And then we put it into our show that he would advocate for people with disabilities, excuse me, within our show. So I think you're right on with being an advocate. Once again, here's James Naughton to read a little bit more from Jeremy's book.
Texas trip. In March 2018, I was sent to a client meeting in Irving, Texas. The facility is the equivalent size of a Walmart with 2 additional floors. I could still walk with forearm crutches, but I knew I would surely tire out before I reached the conference room. To get around their office, I needed a motorized scooter. I had rented them before without much difficulty, though this would be the first time in a business setting. The process went like this. I called my usual scooter rental place and asked them to deliver the scooter to the hotel where I would be staying. I then had to find an Uber with a big enough trunk for the scooter to fit in, not to mention having a driver who would be willing and able to haul this thing in and out of his trunk. When booking the Uber, I allowed sufficient time for any theatrics or mechanical difficulties, but the driver muscled the scooter into the trunk and we were off to the client site. While the meeting was important, I was more interested to see how a corporate office would accommodate the flame red scooter and my novice driving skills. As it turned out, the 2 days I was there weren't difficult physically, but I found being confined to this scooter frustrating from a business interaction perspective. There were nearly 30 people attending this meeting from across the United States, and when my team and I arrived in the lobby, it seemed as though everyone attending had arrived at once. Negotiating the registration desk was the first challenge, as I had to stand to talk to the security guard. This may not seem to be a big deal to someone who isn't in a wheelchair, but from a seated position, you have to reach above your head to hand over your ID, and you have to contort awkwardly to be seen by the camera taking your badge picture. You soon realize this world wasn't made for you. The elevator was the next challenge. The doors opened and there were already people in the elevator and they weren't getting out. Shit, now what? Watch your toes, I'm coming in, I warned. In hindsight, I should have backed in, making it easier to exit. But who doesn't enjoy breaking a few cultural norms? Try facing the wrong way next time you're in an elevator and watch the looks of discomfort on the passengers' faces. Navigating the hallways and corridors of the sprawling, carpeted ocean of cubicles proved to be fairly easy with the scooter. We arrived at the conference room and found that several of the attendees had already taken their seats. Normally, this would be the time for me to make my way around to say hello to the people I knew, but a quick survey of the room showed that traversing the chairs, briefcases, and shoulder bags strewn everywhere would make the greeting ritual an impossibility. 30 people were squeezed into a conference room that was meant to hold 12. Although having the scooter meant I had my own seat and a nifty basket that held my belongings, the dimensions of the scooter made me overly obtrusive in the room. Self-conscious and distracted, I also realized I was locked into my parking space and would be unable to easily excuse myself. What if I had to use the bathroom? Forget about it. Ask them to turn up the heat and hope you sweat the urge away. The meeting itself went well, while I tried to push the upcoming challenges of the rest of the day out of my mind. Navigating back to the lobby elevator, would the button be difficult to reach? Would there be closed doors in my way with no one around to open them? How exactly would the bathroom work? Will I find the right type of Uber vehicle again? Heightened anxiety naturally comes along with this lovely diagnosis, and this experience made me realize why. As the meeting wrapped up, everyone began to pair off, shake hands, and make plans to move their projects forward. Except me. I was trapped at a seated height while everyone talked above my head. I was sort of already used to this, being 5 feet 7 inches tall and the shortest of my friends, but this was a humbling experience, being overlooked and excluded.
Elliott.
Yak, 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 and I get it wrong. Okay, I'm right here. Now I'm good. All right. When Tiffany reached out to me about being a part of this event, I said yes right away. And then we talked about having someone read excerpts from Jeremey's book. I had just directed James Naughton in a version of A Christmas Carol and thought he would be perfect. And when I called him, he was just as eager to help out. And I'm so glad that he did. In fact, I had a conversation with him about his connection to ALS. Here it is.
Joining us now is James Naughton. Thank you so much for reading excerpts from Jeremey's book.
My pleasure.
We wanted to touch base with you, too, about your own personal connection to ALS. It's touched your life in a couple of different ways, right?
Yeah, well, most recently, of course, we lost a great, grand leading lady of the Broadway stage who just had really one of my favorite voices, Rebecca Luker, just a year ago. And she's married to Danny Burstein, and he and I have been in touch since that happened. We are members of a fraternity that nobody wants to join, which is we are both guys who've lost our spouses. My wife died of pancreatic cancer. Rebecca, of course. And so Danny and I, and another wonderful Broadway actor, who's Jason Daniely, lost Marin Macy a couple years ago. But ALS was the thing that took Rebecca. And I had a very, very close friend, Bill Bledsoe, who was not a performer, but he and I coached. In the 70s, we were living in outside of California, outside of LA in California. And he and I coached a 12 and 13-year-old girls softball team in 74 and 75. And we were best friends. Our families were together. Our wives loved each other. And I loved Bill. And a few years later, we moved back to Connecticut in 76, but we stayed close and we saw each other every year, either here or there. And in the 80s, he developed ALS. I was working in the Williamstown Theater Festival the summer of '84. And Bill and his wife and 3 children got on a van and drove across the country and came and stayed with us while I was working on the stage in Williamstown for 3 weeks. And every night I would go off to make my 7:30 half hour. And at 10 minutes of 8, the van would roll into the theater driveway, and I'd run outside and grab Bill and put him in a wheelchair and lift him, hump him up the stairs. There were a lot of stairs to get into the theater, and roll him down the aisle and put him in the seat on the aisle, and then race around. The curtain would go up, and we'd do the show. And after the show, I'd change my clothes and run around and grab him and put him back in the chair, and off we'd go to the cabaret. And I'd roll him into the restaurant where we were going to be doing an after-show cabaret, and he and his family and my family and all the kids I'd get everybody drinks, and then I'd go around and do the show, and afterwards back we'd go to our home, which we didn't get back to until the house I was renting for the summer, until probably 1 or 2 in the morning. But we spent a lot of time together, and in fact, when he was dying, getting close to the end, Ellen, his wife, called and she said, I know you're in rehearsals, aren't you, for the Glass Menagerie, which I was doing with Joanne Woodward and Karen Allen at the Long Wharf. And I said, yeah. She said, any chance you could come out here? I said, is Bill getting close? She said, yes. And I said, let me see. And I talked to Nikos, our director, and I said, you remember the fellow that I used to, a year or two ago, summer or two ago, roll around in the chair? And he said, yeah. I said, well, he's getting close. And his wife asked if I could come out. He said, go. So I got on a plane and spent Friday, Saturday, and Sunday with Bill and Ellen, and he died a week later. And then she said, could you come out here? And I said, yeah, when are you going to do it? She said, when are you free? And I said, how about Monday? So Sunday night, we got on a plane, the family, and we flew out to LA and had the funeral on Monday, and Tuesday we flew back. But I got a really up close view of and knowledge of what that disease means to have and to a whole family. We were very, very close and remained close all through it. There's Chris Reeve used to tell me, and Chris was, in a wheelchair for 9 years after his accident, and I used to see him. I'd go down and we'd hang out. He said, oh yeah, he said, all the paraplegics, we all say, and the quadriplegics, we all say, the guys with ALS, they have it much worse than we do. Which is a sad commentary, but it's true, and it's where it stands on the ladder of terrible things that can happen to you or to your loved one. Well, anyway, this is a disease that I've unfortunately had a lot of experience with up close. And so it means a lot to me what's going on here, and anything that we can do to raise the consciousness of or raise money for research into a cure or a prevention of ALS would be tremendous. So it's nice to be able to, for me, to be able to be of any kind of help here. And if reading Jeremey's excerpts from his book qualifies, then I'm really glad to do it.
James Naughton, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure, Elliott. Good to see you.
Clearly, it affected James Naughton's life on a number of different levels. I think it affects all of us, maybe more than we know. Jeremey, what advice would you give those who may be newly diagnosed or who recently found out, for example, that a loved one might have been diagnosed?
It's difficult to give advice to the ALS community since everyone's journey is wildly different. When I look back at my own experience, I would suggest 3 things. Number 1, learn everything you can about the disease. With a rare disease, it's entirely possible that your favorite doctor hasn't encountered a patient in her practice with your condition or symptoms. And that's okay. Becoming knowledgeable about what's happening to you is the best way to ensure you get the help you need. Number 2, surround yourself with the people who are motivated to help you. I call this my care team. These are the doctors and caregivers, healers, and psychics, and even the weird guy down the street who sells you weed. My team knows everything I'm going through. I gave them access to all my important information and websites. So, in the event something happens, my care team can step in and make sure everything continues uninterrupted. Finally, number 3, and I touched on this earlier. Become your own healthcare champion. I've written extensively on this topic both in my book and in my blog. You can find the blog at neversayinvisible.com. This is so important that I'd go so far as to say, it's a matter of life or death. When you advocate for yourself or someone else, you'll get access to resources, treatments, and knowledge that you might have waited months for if you didn't advocate for yourself. In other words, the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Jeremy, you mentioned the weird guy down the street that got you weed. A part of your journey, part of everyone's journey with this, with ALS, is to try to find different ways to alleviate symptoms, including marijuana. Once again, here's James Naughton reading from your book.
Since the beginning of this journey, I've been on a mission to find something, anything, that was going to alleviate my symptoms. While waiting for my medical marijuana card to arrive, I needed immediate relief. So what better place to visit than the mile-high city of Denver, Colorado? The air is clean, the scenery is stunning, and the weed is plentiful. I'd been to Denver before, though not in a wheelchair and not to buy weed. The mission was simple. Visit a bunch of dispensaries, buy a fistful of edibles, and try them all to see what could work to alleviate my symptoms. But where does one go to find such places? Some stoners had at least one brilliant idea between bong rips and created Leafly, a website that lists all medical and recreational marijuana dispensaries across the country. And for your smoking pleasure, there's a convenient app to enable you to find the dispensary nearest to you. Within a few blocks of where I was staying, there were 4 dispensaries. So I set out to find them and learn as much as I could about what would help me overcome these horrible symptoms. For an industry that's all about compassionate care, I was surprised by a few things consistent across the various stores. To start with, a large number of locations aren't handicapped accessible. There are no handicapped height counters where someone in a wheelchair can easily interact with the person behind the counter. Then the majority of the devices designed to consume weed require a considerable amount of dexterity to operate. There are edibles, tinctures, and even suppositories. But if you want the old school bud and your hands don't work, you are shit out of luck. Those nuances aside, I got quite an education. This is some scientific shit, man. No longer do you need to rely on your dealer to bring you whatever weed he might have received from the mule that supplied him. You can walk into a dispensary, look over an extensive menu of options, and decide what kind of experience you want. I was under the impression that weed is weed. Quite the contrary. With the exception of a small handful of dispensary employees I met, most were willing to spend as much time as I wanted, educating me on the considerable range of products available at their store. At a high level, there are really only 2 things to consider: indica versus sativa, and THC versus CBD, tetrahydrocannabinol versus cannabidiol. All the available choices are simply different combinations of those 4 components. For example, if you want something to help you sleep, go heavier with the indica with more THC. Want something to help you make it through another insufferable meeting where you know you'll be called on? Stick to a sativa that's heavier on the CBD. If you're one of those people prone to Googling every pimple, cough, or muscle ache until you have convinced yourself you have a rare form of necrotizing fasciitis, you'll want to stay away from the Alice-sized rabbit hole weed and all that its varieties offer. I know I'm going to get slammed by weed aficionados for oversimplifying this, but for the purposes of venturing into the wide world of weed, it isn't that hard. But, Jeremy, aren't you a coffee lover? Isn't the coffee universe just as complex? How could you simplify the complexities of that special plant and all it offers? Sure, there are all sorts of coffees from all over the world, and an equally dizzying array of methods of preparing the sweet brown goodness. However, for most just venturing into their first few cups, there are two types: good coffee and the shit served in hotel lobbies. No need to write a dissertation on the subject. Keep it simple.
I think I can tell by the smile on your face, Jeremy, you're good if James Naughton plays you in the movie version of your book. Our sincere thanks to James Naughton for reading excerpts from Jeremy's book tonight. And of course, thanks to Jeremy for sharing your story, for your great energy. Any additional thoughts on how you stay positive?
I really appreciate this opportunity to share my story. I hope that you find inspiration to take control of your own health, so you can live your best life possible. Before I go, I'll share something personal that I look at every day. It grounds me when I get overwhelmed. Here it goes. Instead of self-pity, fear, and isolation, I choose the following. I choose not to lie in bed waiting for my time to come. I choose to spend my days with those who love me. I choose to invest in myself. I choose to defend my terms. I choose how to spend my time. I choose to eliminate negativity. I choose to love unconditionally. I choose to wear funny t-shirts. I choose music over silence. I choose to pay for high-quality healthcare. I choose to take risks. I choose to tear down my barriers. I choose to speak definitively. I choose the hard path because it's the right path. I choose to say yes. My name is Jeremey Schreiber, and I thank you again.
Jeremy, you're an inspiration. You truly are an inspiration. Thank you so much for doing this tonight. Tiffany Card, who kicked us off from the ALS Association, Greater New York Chapter. Can you tell us a little bit more about how to be a strong advocate?
Happy to. So for many of you who may be new to the ALS Association Greater New York Chapter, we're a nonprofit organization that assists people living with ALS and their caregivers, serving the 5 boroughs: Long Island, Mid-Hudson Valley, and Northern New Jersey. And how do we do that? It's a 3-pronged approach. It's pretty basic here. It's free patient services, cutting edge research, and advocating for policies that work to expand government support for research. So those free community care pieces provide medical equipment, loan equipment, different kinds of communication devices, resources, training, transportation to clinic appointments, and emotional support to people with ALS and their caregivers. And you can learn more by visiting our website, which is als-ny.org, which I'll drop in the chat in a second. And then as a nonprofit, of course, we rely solely on grants and support from people like you. And that enables us to provide our services free of charge to those living with ALS and their caregivers. And you can support us tonight if you are so inclined as part of May is ALS Awareness Month on our website. And I'll also drop that link in the chat as well. Thanks to Jeremy and James and Elliott so much for helping us out here.
Tiffany, I was happy to help, and I just wanted to underscore how important it is to give to the ALS chapter. We have a fund drive coming up in New York Public Radio, and we always say it doesn't really matter how much you give. It just matters that you give. The amount doesn't really matter. You can give as little as $5,000 or $10,000 to the ALS Association, and it definitely goes a long way. So support the ALS chapter, and it was my honor to be with you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Jeremy.